Quantitative easing exposed, how it destroys a society. I'm going to explain this to you in 3 simple, fast steps. Step number 1, how QE works or is supposed to work. The Federal Reserve prints up all this money out of nowhere, and it goes to the pension funds, the insurance company, the hedge funds, basically financial institutions, and it buys treasuries from them. The financial institutions take some of that money and they deposit it into the banking system. The banking system has more deposits. This incentivizes them to lend more. It's not that they lend the deposits, but they have an incentive to lend more. So they take and they loan that money into the private sector or create additional loans for the private sector, which means they're producing more cows, wheat, and cotton in our simple economy. If they produce more cows, wheat, and cotton, that means that these people don't have to produce those items for themselves. So we have more doctors, more teachers, more Elon Musks or Steve Jobs. We have a better society for everyone involved. The financial institutions take the rest of that money, which is the majority, and they go into the stock market, they buy stocks, and they go into the corporate bond market to buy bonds. They do this because the Fed is creating additional supply or artificial supply for these treasury bonds. That increases the price, which lowers the yield. As we know, there's an inverse relationship between those two. So if treasuries become less attractive, that's what motivates the financial institutions to go further out the risk curve in search of yield. And let's remember that a lot of those corporations that sell the bonds to the pensions specifically take that money and go right back into the stock market to buy their own shares back, which makes the stock market go higher and higher and higher. Now that you've seen how quantitative easing is supposed to work, let's see how QE actually works in real life. The Fed prints up all this money, which props up the market. This signals to the financial institutions and everyone in the financial economy that there is a Fed put. And what we mean by that is the Fed is signaling that they're going to backstop the market. They're only going to allow it to go down to a certain level before they come rushing right in with newly printed money and inject more liquidity into the system. This creates what they call a moral hazard. It's really important that you guys understand this concept. So let's go to Investopedia right now and see what the exact definition is. Moral hazard is the idea that a party protected in some way from risk will act differently. I want to emphasize that. Will act differently than if they didn't have the protection to begin with. So because there is a Fed put, this changes the behavior and the incentive structure for all of the participants involved. How does this play out? Let's go ahead and use the banks as an example. Typically what they would do in a healthy system is they would create additional money supply or loans and inject them into the real economy to help small businesses and medium-sized businesses grow, create more goods and services. Instead, what they do is they just create consumption lending because the interest rates are sky high and mortgages, which really just go into increasing asset prices. It doesn't go into the economy creating more stuff, which is what we want. Because when the economy creates more stuff, that decreases wealth inequality, it grows the economy in a healthy way, and it keeps inflation very low. The banks take those mortgages and they sell them to who else other than Fannie and Freddie, the government-sponsored enterprises. Boo, boo, boo. Fannie and Freddie takes those mortgages, they bundle them up into our favorite acronym, which is MBS, or mortgage-backed securities. They sell them right back to the financial institutions, some of which are groups or investment banks like Goldman Sachs, that take those mortgage-backed securities as collateral and shoot them into the repo market to get cash overnight or as a term loan. They take that cash, they go to the corporate bond market, buy more bonds, the corporations take that money and go right back into the stock market, taking the stock market to all-time highs while being completely detached from the real economy, which is actually staying the same size, if not shrinking. The takeaway with step number one is the financial economy should have a relationship or a direct relationship with the real economy. I know that sounds shocking. Why is that? Because the profits that the businesses generate in the real economy, of course, drives their earnings per share and their stock price. What happens in reality is the financial economy is this giant behemoth. It's like a Jabba the Hutt economy, just big, fat, and bloated, relative to the economy that it is supposed to reflect. And this is because of the Fed put, that moral hazard, and them injecting all of this funny money into the financial framework. This is totally unsustainable. And the problem really arises when the people that are in the real economy start taking the majority of their net worth and putting it into the financial economy because they see asset prices growing. This means 401k, IRA, home equity. Therefore, a lot of the demand that goes into the real economy is now generated from the financial economy. More on that later in step number 3. And to give you an idea of how bad it is right now, the market cap, meaning the size of the stock market relative to GDP, going back to the 1970s and 80s, was 50%. Now it's 150%. Step number 2, not all quantitative easings are the same. We really need to get our minds around this to put the pieces of the puzzle together and understand how quantitative easing destroys a society. There were 3 main attempts at quantitative easing: Japan, Europe, and the United States. To dive into these further, let's go to a video with economist Richard Werner.
This is an interview from RT Television. We'll put a link in the description below for the full interview. I'd strongly suggest watching it. It's awesome. Werner starts off by talking about Japan.
What they did is expand banks' reserves at the central bank. This is money the banks have at the central bank, which cannot leave the central bank. It doesn't circulate in the economy. It's stuck at the central bank.
And if that doesn't make sense right now, guys, don't worry about it. I'm going to explain that on the whiteboard as soon as we get done with this video.
Now, what good does that do the economy? Nothing. So I had warned actually already when I proposed the true quantitative easing, that type of monetarist narrow money expansion is not going to work. But unfortunately, that's what they tried, and they called it quantitative easing entirely misleadingly because there's already half a dozen names for that: reserve expansion, M0 expansion, high-powered money expansion, monetary base expansion. Why call that QE? You see, this is part of their strategy to obfuscate and confuse people. So they didn't do what I advised, and neither is the ECB taking my advice.
Okay, now we're going to go into Europe, and you can tell that Werner has consulted with a lot of central banks, and you can tell he's rather frustrated dealing with them.
What is the ECB doing? It is just increasing banks' reserves at the central bank, and the money that it's injecting is going entirely into financial markets. We'll get more financial speculation. And
so step number 1, very similar to Japan, but they took it a step further by going in and buying assets in the financial market.
Big banks will make money, and those ex-central bankers working at the big banks will do well, but the real economy will not really be positively affected.
Okay, now he starts talking about the United States specifically.
Yes, I think Ben Bernanke was trying to make the point that his unconventional monetary policy, as they call it, is different from the Japanese-style QE. And what is the main difference? Well, what I proposed in Japan should be done to quickly reflate the economy is basically, if you boil it down to the 2 most important policies, it's a 2-step program. Number 1, the central bank goes to the banks. And of course, the problem is the banks are not creating credit. Credit creation is shrinking, it is negative, because the banks have huge bad debts on their balance sheets. They don't know what to do. They trouble themselves. So the central bank says, okay, we'll clean up your balance sheets. And no, we don't want the taxpayer to have to pay for this, because the taxpayer is not responsible for this. The taxpayer didn't create those bad debts. In fact, we as the central bank, we're largely responsible. So we'll take...
Oh, did you hear that? Even Richard Werner agrees with all of us. It all goes back to the central banks. They're at the core of the problem.
Care of this, there will be zero cost to the taxpayer, zero cost to society, zero new costs. The real costs, of course, were already in the past of this enormous resource misallocation.
And what did he just say there? A misallocation of resources. I talk about it in almost every one of my videos, that a healthy economy is based on allocating scarce resources with alternative uses very well. And when the central banks come in and manipulate things, it alters how those resources are used in the economy and distorts the whole process and makes it much, much worse.
It's silly to add new costs. So the central bank buys those non-performing assets from the banks, let's say at face value, which is of course much higher than the real market value. So the banks overnight are completely solvent, more flush and liquid, stronger balance sheets than ever before.
Let's start with Japan. The BOJ, their banking system, and a very simplified version of their bank's balance sheets. They had these toxic assets, and I'm not sure if they had mortgage-backed securities and asset-backed securities, but they definitely had some of my MGSs, which are more garbage securities. Technical term that you'll only hear on this channel. The Bank of Japan went to the banks, and instead of buying their toxic assets or buying bonds from the private sector, they came in and just gave them some additional reserves to make sure that they wouldn't go out of business, and that they had reserves to go ahead and continue lending out to the real economy. The problem with that, according to Werner, is that the toxic assets were still on the balance sheets of the banks, which prevented them or disincentivized them to lend out into the real economy and expand the money supply further. The ECB did the same thing as Japan, where they added reserves to the accounts that the banks have on their accounts with the ECB to make sure that they weren't going to go bust. But additionally, they went into the financial sector, like we talked about in step number 1, printed money out of thin air and purchased bonds to try to juice the stock market and the corporate bond market. Bernanke took it one step further. He also added reserves to the accounts that the banks have with the Federal Reserve. He went into the market and purchased bonds with money created out of thin air, but he also printed more money to buy the toxic assets from the banks. So he moved these mortgage-backed securities from the bank's balance sheets to the balance sheet of the Federal Reserve. The idea was to free them up and to make it seem like nothing had ever happened so they can continue to lend into the real economy, which, according to Werner, is the ideal. You may be asking yourself, man, if Bernanke comes in and just buys all these toxic assets from the bank and pretends that nothing ever happened or they didn't do anything wrong, just waves the magic wand, doesn't that create a huge moral hazard moving forward? Bingo. You just hit the nail on the head. Now you're starting to connect the dots. Let's tie it all together right now in step number 3. Step number 3, the Fed cannot stop quantitative easing. Going back to our earlier example of a healthy system, we have the real economy that contributes to the financial economy. Because of the small and mid-sized businesses producing goods and services, this allows the economy to expand, and the financial economy is a representation of that. In other words, the dog wags the tail. Now, because of all the Fed's artificially low interest rates, quantitative easing, and every other financial engineering shenanigan that we've had over the past couple decades, the economy is built on asset prices, debt, and confidence. The financial economy completely consumes the real economy, and the real economy is now driven by the asset prices in the financial economy. So the demand inside of this circle is created by the circle that consumes it, which is produced by the Federal Reserve. So the tail wags the dog. As an example of this, look at the Powell rate hikes. Remember how those were on autopilot? What happened to that? Remember they were doing QT that, whoops, immediately turned into QE again? When you pull up a chart of the S&P 500 and the Fed's balance sheet, you'll see that there's a direct correlation, and this really makes sense. If you think about the economy the way it was set up, in a very simple way, we'll just use the cows, wheat, and cotton. Maybe back in the 1800s before we had the Federal Reserve. What would have happened if the stock market would have crashed in 1800? Zero. Nothing. Or take a country like Colombia. What would happen if the stock market went down by 30% in Colombia? Nothing. What would happen in the United States if the stock market went down by 30 or 40%? Well, it's pretty easy. All we have to do is go back and look at 2009 and the financial crisis. Housing went down by 50% and it was complete chaos. The entire world economy was on the brink of collapse. Why? Because the financial economy is so much larger right now than the real economy. So the Fed needs to do everything they can to continually increase asset prices, increase debt, and maintain confidence. But the only tools that they have to do that are artificially low interest rates and quantitative easing. This produces extreme wealth inequality because only a small portion of the population actually own the assets that the Fed is driving up in price. The rest of the population drown in a sea of debt. Student loan debt, auto debt, consumption debt. It makes it impossible for them to save money. Because the Fed has distorted the real economy so much, it makes it impossible for them to attain what they need to actually get ahead. Oh, but wait, there is more. Remember the moral hazard. And remember how what Bernanke did was different than the ECB and the Bank of Japan. He went in and took all of those assets, those toxic assets, off of the bank's balance sheets. This incentivizes them to take more risk on a moving forward basis. Why shouldn't they take risk when they know they've got the Federal Reserve to come in and clean up after them? They privatize the profits and they socialize the losses. That's exactly what Bernanke did. That creates this boom-bust cycle that gets bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger until the Fed can't backstop it anymore, and it results in a huge collapse of the entire system. Then a politician like Elizabeth Warren comes in and says, hey guys, I've got a solution. Let's do a wealth tax, create more regulations, and increase the size of government. Of course, the only thing that would do is create fewer rich people, and then the only rich people we would have that own assets would have to have political connections, crony capitalism. This would increase the amount of poor people that we actually have because it would eliminate the middle class. And all of the 99% would be even more dependent on the government than they were over here. It eliminates the middle class. There's a massive capital flight out of the country because who wants to be an entrepreneur in this type of environment? Society is then destroyed. And it's all a result of quantitative easing. For more information like this, check out this content right here, and I will see you on the next video.